Okay. Are we live now?
All right. I believe we are live. Excellent. Yes, we are. Sweet. All right. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone who's tuning in from various parts of the world. Sorry for the brief delay, and welcome to this very special panel discussion on the occasion of World Press Freedom Day, titled Journalism is Crime. We're talking about the issues faced by Julian Assange, faced by intrepid journalists across the world, from states, from various actors. And we have with us two very special guests who I'll introduce shortly. But before we get to that, I'd quickly like to, for those of you who are new to this YouTube page, to this Facebook page, wherever you're watching it on, I'd like to introduce the organizations which are holding this panel. We begin with our host, Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Many of you must have already read Tricontinental's work. It's a research organization with a very unique focus on countries of the global south, on social movements of the global south. They have a lot of work. They have monthly dossiers. They have research papers. They have small documents called red alerts, which focus on the issues faced by these movements, the questions posed by these movements, and the struggles of these movements across the world. So I encourage you to check out the work of Tricontinental. And they've also released a dossier, a red alert on Julian Assange, which I think will also be in the links over here. This event is also hosted by the International People's Assembly, which is a coalition, it's a platform of organizations from across the world, social movements, political organizations, which have sought to raise the issues faced by the working class, faced by farmers. And one of their key campaigns, one of their key global campaigns has been for the freedom of Julian Assange. Over the past many years, the International People's Assembly has been working very tirelessly to mobilize support for Julian Assange, for his freedom and against his illegal imprisonment. And finally, People's Dispatch, my organization, which I represent, we are also an international media organization which focuses very similarly on the struggles of people's movements, workers' movements, farmers' movements, etc., social movements trying to build a better world and a better society. And even for us, Julian Assange, the issue of Julian Assange, his imprisonment, the questions he's raised through his journalism continue to animate us, continue to inspire us. And so his life and his work have remained a very key central focus and inspiration for us. So today we are talking on May 3rd, that is World Press Freedom Day. And of course, World Press Freedom Day marks it was officially declared in 1993, which makes this the 30th anniversary of that declaration. But it commemorates what is known as the Windhoek Declaration that came out in 1991, where a group of African journalists held a meeting and talked about a variety of issues and released this declaration on May 3rd. Now, this is a declaration I urge all of you to sort of read. It's a very short document, but it actually raises some of the key issues that are very, very relevant in journalism today, despite all these years passing by. It's not just journalism as this kind of idealistic concept or vague declarations of freedom of expression or, those kind of freedoms, but very, very concrete examination of the issues facing journalism. And many years before social media became a thing, many years before media monopolies became a thing, the Windhoek Declaration actually, asked Windhoek Declaration actually posed these questions, and it continues to be very relevant today. So it's in this context that we are having this panel, the question of who is, what does press freedom mean in today's context, in the context of course, social media, the context of fake news, but more importantly, in the context of states which claim that they are flag bearers of democracy, states which claim to be that they are the democracies versus the so-called authoritarian regimes. But their record is actually very, very different. And to talk about this, we have with us two very, very special guests. And we start, of course, with Tista Setilwar. Tista is very well known in India and abroad as an activist. Of course, she's been an iconic activist, a voice for demanding justice, accountability for the victims of the 2002 communal riots in Gujarat, and one of the few voices who has kept that struggle going for nearly 2 decades now. But Tista is also, while she's most well known as an activist, but she's also a journalist, and I think she has worked, of course, with mainstream media organizations, but she also left that, founded Communalism Combat, a very iconic magazine in the early 90s, right after the demolition of the mosque called Babri Masjid. And of course, she's also one of the brains behind Sabrang. And Tista's work has really, I think, for many, many people like me who grew up in the late 90s and 2000s, that work was really kind of inspiring and was a huge revelation as well. So thank you so much, Tista, for joining us today. And we also have Prabir Purkayastha, where I'm dispensing journalistic norms of objectivity while talking about Prabir, because I also work very closely with him. Prabir, of course, founded NewsClick, an independent media platform in 2009, way before there was a wave of independent media organizations in India. He founded it with this very key objective that NewsClick should talk about the struggle, the struggling masses of India, the organized struggling masses of India, see how news can be presented from their perspective, bring their perspective and their views and their struggles to the center stage, rather than news being just the prerogative of some leaders or some presidents or some ministers. And NewsClick has continued in that with that message for all these years. So I can't think of two people more eminently qualified to talk about some of the issues we are going to talk about today. I'd like to begin with Tista, actually, and look at World Press Freedom Day as a concept in itself. Now, World Press Freedom Day has actually, unfortunately, become a lot about lists. We get lists with rankings, this number, that number, and it's valid. I mean, of course, these declines in relative positions actually capture some amount of reality. There's no doubt about that. But also, World Press Freedom Day has the notion of press freedom itself is kind of increasingly becoming a bit of a slogan. It's become something that's often used as a weapon as well, in the sense of, oh, we are more free than you. We are the defenders of democracy, etc. We are the true democracy. Whereas, the question of actually in depth, what really does press freedom mean in today's context with the kind of challenges we have? We have, of course, like I said, social media, we have state repression. So how do you sort of, with your experience, see press freedom in today's context? Lisa, you're muted.
And thank you very much for TriCon and the others for having me here on this very prestigious panel. I just want to start on this very important subject, which is very complex, as you put it yourself, by saying that, when we talk about press freedom, freedom of expression, we need to first of all realize that these are not abstract, universal. I think we just need to stress that, because if you just keep talking about freedom of expression and the media in terms of just an abstract notion of freedom of expression, without looking at some of the key structural, political and social issues involved, then I think we just miss the bus. And of course, I'd like to pay my personal and my organizational tributes and salutes to Julian Assange, who remains 11 years incarcerated. And I think whatever little or more we can do, we have done less than many others on this panel have. But I think whatever we can do to raise our voices to ensure not just his release from incarceration, but the stigmatization of the journalism that he represented, I think would be too little too late. We need to really raise our voices against that. So coming back to what I'd like saying is that we need to look at it in terms of structural socio-economic crisis, in terms of the global order crisis, in terms of the climate crisis, in terms of, I think, a huge transfer of private capital public resources to private capital, which we use the word neoliberalism for. It's certainly not liberal reform. And I think my world of journalism, our world of journalism in India took a huge hit. And when you saw this huge structural change take place, which impacted ownership of the media, which impacted security of individual journalists and collectives of journalists working in the media, and through that attack has actually affected the quality of journalism itself. And unless we are able to see this connection, I think we'll just be talking about, like you said, rankings and of course individual hero stories, which are important and remain important. But we won't, for instance, look at, which I think most of India is not looking today at, the fact that what is the state of Jammu and Kashmir, where there are, there's no internet, there's no radio, how many journalists are incarcerated, what is it like to undertake fair and free and independent journalism in, say, Bastar or Chhattisgarh, or some of the areas which are kind of talked about by the state as armed insurgent state, but actually where there's a huge loot of private capital going on with minerals of this country. And in my home state, which is supposedly a liberal progressive state, Maharashtra, the sight of a young journalist, Sashikant Wagmare, being mowed down just a month and a half back in February this year, because he was reporting courageously on a refinery that was going to completely, take over livelihoods of villages in the Konkan region, the Barsu refinery. And not just that, but, historical artifacts, you have prehistoric paintings in that area, and we all don't just seem to care. So I think there are many, many levels of this. And I think it's not about stigmatizing one kind of targeting or violence against another. Of course, my work has been devoted to Hindutva right, and one is not at all ashamed of it, and what that particular brand of politics has done to free expression. But I think this has to be looked at, majoritarianism and its attack on free thought, criminalization of thought, and weaponizing of the commercial electronic media through hate speech against the minorities, which we are seeing in an incredibly vicious form, particularly since 2019, is something of great, great concern. I don't want to hog the time right in the beginning. I'm sure we'll come back to some of these themes. I just wanted to open with these remarks.
Thanks, Isa. Those are actually interesting points also. I think connecting in some senses to the Windhoek Declaration as well, because he talked about that, of course, there is a particular kind of repression that journalists face, and like you gave the example of Shashikant, a very brutal example and a very tragic example. But there are also questions of monopolies and economies. There are questions of trade, journalists not being able to organize and form trade unions, and these were all identified as very key sectors of journalism itself. Praveen, I'd like to come to you and bring us, maybe start us off also on this on our discussion of Julian Assange. Now, like Tisa very aptly said, we've all, I think, across, we've tried our best to sort of raise the issue as often as possible, but it definitely still globally hasn't been raised enough, because if it were raised enough, every time, say, Joe Biden would talk about democracy, there'd be 10 people asking what about Julian Assange, and that's not happened. And there's been there's been this huge campaign of stigmatization, calling him names, first trying to ignore him, then trying to malign him. Everything has happened. So also for the, how do you understand the paradigm shifting journalism that Assange did? As in, what was Assange's unique contribution to journalism in the time he was, in the early 2000s, in the mid 2000s and stuff?
It's actually, when you look at this, there are two aspects that I think we need to address. One is that journalism, of course, is also, of course, as both of you have talked about, is showing the effects of increased monopolies, and the fact that even the extension, or shall we say, multiple voices that existed. For instance, on international news. In India, we had PTI, and there are other international news platforms available. Today, almost all global international news comes from just a couple of international agencies. So this monopolization, it's gone hand in hand with increased monopolies. Also, rise of new technologies and therefore the possibility, we thought, of more democratization, which has not happened. Earlier, we thought, okay, internet will provide multiple options on their own television, radio equivalents, news equivalents. Now we have really Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, who again is centralization at an enormous level. So you have that as at one level that has happened. And this is because every few decades, it changes the nature of public communications from newspapers to radio to television. Mass communication has changed today also to what is called social media in the internet. So we all believe that this would allow more things to happen. And Julian, I think, was one of the persons to think about that in this age, it's how are you able to get information and disseminate to a much larger body, even if for a small organization. And that was really the things that states do not want to become public. Therefore, how could that be put to the public? And WikiLeaks is perhaps the most important example of that even today, that they were the first to look at what is part of the Iraq war logs, and then Afghanistan war logs, and of course then various other things which we still mine for what is called the papers that all the US embassies and all exchanged among themselves. So all of that is even, say, fighting the Diego Garcia base, war, US military base at the Chagos Islanders, who were dispossessed of that whole island, sent somewhere else. All this we find at the end of it, the resource will not be shut down. Even today, if you want to look for any of that information, it's available through WikiLeaks. So Julian has done something which nobody thought was possible. Create an information base deep down inside the states, also being able to get and also to realize that deep strikes of this kind are possible because of the centralization of information of the same kind, which leads to mass communication concentration like YouTube and Facebook, also allows a huge infrastructure which the states are creating, open to deep strikes of what Chelsea Manning did, or which was done later on by Snowden, that these are possible. So I think he was one of the first to see this. And of course, that was the big things. And the kind of consensus they had built on the Iraq war, in which Saddam Hussein was a bad guy, and he had weapons of mass destruction. Even today, in the United States, a good number of people, probably 40 to 50% still believe that, in spite of all the things we know. But the leaks could not be shut up. And both in the case of Chelsea Manning and the case of Snowden, and both of this WikiLeaks was quite actively involved in at least getting Snowden from Hong Kong to Russia. Sally Harrison actually went down there and helped him do that. So all of I think shows that the enormous strength of the state, that they have this huge intelligence apparatus in which they can percolate into every crevice of our life. At the same time, the weakness of the state, that today somebody playing in Discord in a game, this actually discloses state secrets. And for 1 year, the state doesn't know about it. Apparently, this has been happening for the last year. He was sharing this to a small group, and it only became public because somebody then put it in a larger group. So this is the weakness of the state as well as the strength of the state. And I think really that's his political vision to see this. and also his technological acumen to set up a WikiLeaks, which has become still so difficult for the state to shut down. So then they have loosed all the dogs of war they can on Julian. First in the Ecuador embassy, 7 years, and then one man, to make an example out of him, not because they think that they will get back their legitimacy, not that they can still shut down WikiLeaks, the documents are still available, but to see vengeance, execute vengeance against Julian for the humiliated stumbling out like this. And I will end with only one last comment on this. You know, earlier when you had Pentagon Papers, it was Daniel Ellsberg. He was somebody who had a very high level of clearance. Next, when the Deep Throat, Washington Watergate scandal, then it was the number 2 in the FBI. So you had very high level officials which had access to the information. Today, Chelsea Manning, she was a corporal, not very high up in the defense ladder. You have this guy, Taxera, is 21 years old, and he was again a very low level flunky, as it would appear, because technical support, and of course, Snowden was a sysadmin and a contractor. So technology means you have then to depend on people who are not top of the hierarchy, but they really control the nuts and bolts of the system, and therefore they have access. This is the tragedy for the information state, who believe they can centralize everything, but at the same end, they're also vulnerable to all of this distribution and information to keep the system running, who are people who therefore have access. And apparently Taxera is among that access. So this is, I think, the vulnerability of the state. Can they continue like this? And all the states which believe that if they have more control, they will control us better, forget that more control means also more vulnerabilities. And as long as that exists, that we have to have the ability for people at large to value press freedom, but we also need people who understand technology today. And I'm sure the example that we have before us, they will always be there. And therefore, secrecy of the kind by what you want people to believe is no longer viable. And I think that is the message. Julian has paid a very high price for it. And I hope the media, particularly those organizations like Guardian, New York Times, who benefited from his journalism, abandoned him saying he's not a journalist, okay, would at least now show the courage, and the journalist community at large would accept that, yes, this has been one of the biggest travesties of justice, that you have Julian Assange being condemned for various things. But I think the most significant to say he's not a journalist. Therefore, he does not deserve freedom of speech. Now, I think that is the wheel is turning there. And I hope more and more people will come out to see what Julian Assange has done and what all of us need to do in different.
Connected note, of course, is the fact that the charges the United States has brought against him is of espionage. So he's the first journalist to face espionage charges. And like you said, what he's faced from 2012, 7 years being holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy, dragged out, and today it's important to, I think, note that there are officially no charges against him. He's not being held for any crime. He's being held because a decision is still awaited on his extradition. And, there have been multiple, arguments that have been posed about the state of his mental health, the fact that if he's moved to the United States, he'll facility, and that the prison term the maximum term is 175 years. So even if 175 years are not sentenced, he's probably going to spend most of his productive life in prison. So the fact that I think journalists across the world haven't fully of a huge amount of concern, it's really an urgent it's a really an urgent issue at this point of time because public, and of course, we need to remember that during the Trump administration, they actually drew up plans to assassinate or kidnap Assange from the Ecuadorian embassy. So all these things, really painting a scare. US is humiliated or embarrassed and its secrets are revealed. So, but also pivoting from that point, I think one of the aspects probably you touched about is the question of how Assange was able to sort of create a platform for what is traditionally called whistleblowing. And, whistleblowing is now see a journalist at a source meeting in maybe some underground parking lot or a secret space and exchanging documents. It has become so much more complicated now. And, the amount of surveillance they're facing. So, Tisa, I also just wanted to sort of ask you from your experience, the journalists you have met, to see the challenges really faced by these kind of whistleblowers and journalists working with them in today's context. What kind of, do they have any protections at all in many of these countries, and what can be even done to sort of protect them? Because increasingly it's becoming clear that a lot of these system administrators might be able to provide very, very valuable information about our own governments.
Well, not only system administrators, even the person who prints out the report for the boss, he has the access as well. What you are asking is a much larger question. I think that's why I was wondering while you're talking, Prabir.
Lisa, you're muted, sorry.
I just wanted to add to this excellent discussion by saying why we must constantly harp on what has happened in saying the world's largest and most powerful democracy. We need to also look at the largest democracy, which is also now calls itself the oldest democracy, whatever that means. And I think the reason I'm saying this is not just to nitpick about terminologies or words, or to look at the indexes where our 2 points even below last year's, but to actually talk about a couple of things which are used against a certain kind of journalist and a whistleblower. And I just want to bring in, and I know what Prabir is saying is right, that with the new digital cable network rules going to be brought in with the auditors in place. We know what happened with Pegasus 2 years back, and eventually how that was handled in the highest court. We know all that. Okay, that's all before us. That even when there's evidence of a certain kind, how far can you go and not further? And why even the systems kind of maintain probe beyond that. And we are seeing that unravel in front of our eyes. But I want to just talk about some brass tacks issues, which are, that you are seeing a steady, on the one hand, criminalization of real journalism, and on the other hand, weaponization of a certain colonial laws like sedition and defamation always in place in our country. I'm talking about India. But the manner in which they are being used with this transformed state, the state which is being particularly vicious and transformed now, both majoritarian in terms of the religious social agenda and in terms of a corporate. And you see the kind of defamation suits some journalists are facing. And very often these are criminal defamation suits. And, the court, the Supreme Court has also upheld criminal defamation. Now, many of us kept warning about this, saying that, however much you might feel that such a case comes in. Because I think if you're really committed to civil liberties, you could never defend something like a criminal defamation. So, these are complex arguments which have taken some time in the making. And then you find an institutional agreement between the various institutions of so-called democracy. So, of course, you have the state itself, which is but then you have other apparatus of the state, whether it is the election commission, whether it is even sections of the judiciary and others, which are also using certain extremely opaque norms. And I want to particularly flag the issue of, say, money during elections or huge finances during elections, and all opaque. We don't know where it's certain amount of money was obtained after demonetization. We don't know where that money was actually amassed and to which party it went. These are questions which are all hanging there in our stratosphere, and we know it, we conjecture about it, but there is no scope even to further go there. It gets into extremely murky and dangerous waters. So I think you could face PMLA, you could face you could face an ED, you could face sedition charges, or you can face even UAP, which is a counter-terror law. So all of this is being used very indiscriminately to journalists in general. We've had many kinds of whistleblowers in our past and in our present. And like Probir very rightly pointed out, with technology transforming actually structure, state, and even societal relations, the whistleblower could be anybody, could just be your data technician sitting somewhere. But I'm looking at the more traditional whistleblower, not just the journalist or a lower level revenue official who's actually looking at the way certain amount of land deeds are just being completely doctored and passed on without due process to corporate companies. And it's happening in front of our eyes. We are seeing this data being leaked. But cognizance is just not being taken by the institutions of democracy that are supposed to be correctives in this direction. So my question is that can we talk about, in that sense, world press freedom or freedom of expression in the absolute or the abstract? We have to also be looking at other sorts of mechanisms that need to be effective and accountable, and where the principle of opacity is just simply should not be allowed. We've seen a completely truncating down and a watering down of the Right to Information Act. You have absolutely no information that you can now get out from through RTI, which for a window period for 7, 8, 9 years, you actually were getting information out of a certain quality and kind which you were not able to get before because of a certain enforced little cracks opening up. Today, that's all close government. This is happening because once the state sort of clamps down, there's no political party that really wants to offer this information. You're seeing that as well. So, of course, you have a majoritarian state, a regime at the center, and which is controlling a couple of, 1.5 dozen states. Its opposition are kowtowing to the same processes. So, in that situation, who is the whistleblower? What is the whistleblower? And what are we demanding as the Delhi Union or Bombay Union of Journalists? We are demanding something like stop the labor code, ensure that there is a working journalist act is restored, need for a tripartite wage. Well, these are all traditional demands. I mean, they're of the 80s and 1980s and 1990s. They sound very old, very, very old, hacky demands. We're also demanding laws for the protection of human rights defenders and laws for the protection of journalists. And we write down clauses, we draft it with such meticulousness, and I almost feel like laughing when I sit back and look at it, because there's no section of the authorities, no section of the state is going to accept these categories. They will not accept that if journalist or a human rights activist is who deserves this protection. Because you just look at the kind of cases that are slammed across the board against both categories without any thought. Motives are imputed. Of course, Julian Assange is a mammoth. The way he's been vilified and stigmatized is unbelievable. But it's happening in smaller or larger measure across the board. Any activist representing any movement, the first thing you do, you use the word Khalistani, you use the word extortionist, you use the word any of these names, which is very easy for the state to use. So in that sense, what are we asking for? You're asking for certain protection. And that protection can only come if there's a consensus. And that consensus can only, and movements start taking interest in some of these issues. That they're not simply taking interest in, say, farmers' issues, land rights, agitating against a refinery or against sexual harassment, but are also concerned equally about the fact that you need a down-up questioning in a democracy, which actually looks at the dark secrets of the state, which looks at how the states function, which looks at how the different wings of the state function, And there has to be a window beyond which all this needs to be made public, which is the very principle behind the Right to Information Act. Whereas here we are long years away from that.
That's a interesting intervention, because you're also, I think, one of the aspects you raised also indicates that the question of substance of democracy itself. There is, of course, the norms, what is written in the statute books, what is written in the constitution, but what really is the substance of democracy when we talk about media being. I'd like to bring you here also to sort of ask you on a connected note that when we're talking, for instance, about threats to journalism, I think Tisa has really drawn a very powerful image of some of the significant threats we are facing. But there's also the question, I think, of the voices being drowned. The question of there's been such a proliferation of media, or forms of media in today's age, that there's people not, there's this building of consent using mass media. The lines are blurred between, what is mass media. The information, media world seems so much more complicated right now. How do you sort of understand it? There are 1,000 sources. WhatsApp is, you might as well call WhatsApp a media institution as well. So, all this, how do you sort of see the technological challenge? I asked a question for both of you, but how do we sort of understand the technological, the kind of ecosystem, to use an overused word, the kind of ecosystem that is there in today's world?
It is clear. It understands now that they have to intervene at two levels. One is what you earlier said, which is old-fashioned argument regarding manufacturing consent, where you take the major media houses and you control them. And you control them both in business terms. If you have, say, during the emergency or any new emergency that we are entering into, that you control with direct instruments of repression itself. You can have censorship. You can have Ministry of Truth, which is what the government of India at the moment seems to do. Fact-checking department of the government, which will check facts. And we know the answer is, of course, that all the facts the government says are right. Okay? And everything that is critical of the government is fact-checked wrong. So you could have all those instruments being built up. This is how you control media. But the problem that everybody has today in the world is that there is a whole bunch of other voices, which is loosely called social media. Some of it is social media, but really corporate houses control that. Facebook, these are all corporate control, though they are also thought to be social media. But the point is that the huge other ecosystem, as you put it, which is building up, which allows for a lot of this communication to enter into the larger. Then is the governments cannot stop that from them because it's just too porous. So what is their response? Their response has been really to say, okay, let's fund a whole bunch of organizations to create news which we want. Yeah. And then we can tweak our friends, the YouTube, the Facebooks, other channels. Of course, Tesla can be a little bit of a maverick, but let's face facts. He's very much a contractor of the US government for all his satellite launches. So therefore, there is a strong state interest there as well. So all of this, and particularly the United States controlling a large part of the social media space in the world, let's face it, social media is controlled by the United States. 60% of the internet is English. So it's United States and it's, what should we say, chained dog, pet canary, whatever you want to call it, the United Kingdom, who control the English space of the world. In all of this, that they have decided that creating misinformation is as important as creating information. So we cannot really hide information that will leak out, but we can give misinformation at scale and ask all our friends in the media to really echo that. And that becomes then the what is the post-truth world, the truth. This, I think, is the government response to all of this. And it is not specific to the United States. It's not specific to Turkey. It is not specific to United Kingdom or Europe. It's not specific to India either. That this is the time-tested method that the state has. And in this, some are more crude, the Turkish state, the Indian state. Some states have more finesse because they have been doing it for a lot longer. And I will put the United Kingdom in that category. Now, of course, their veneer is cracking. So a lot of the ugly things are tumbling out. Parties during COVID-19 being only a small part of that. So given all of that, you are seeing that what I would say is always been true, that ultimately you cannot keep truth out of the people. So people will come to know the truth. And if you try and really filter that out, stop that, try to coerce that into the voices not to speak, it still will come. And I think that is something which you can see the success that you can make you can make Iraq war appear as if it was a war against the trade towers being bombed. But at the same time, truth has also percolated to the extent that the world today doesn't think, unlike the American people, a section of whom still believe this, they understand that this is not what happened. This was really an opportunity US took in order to control what it really wanted, which is the West Asia's oil. That was the target. So given all of that, I think, it's not the media space has become much more complex, both for us, but as well as for the state. So I think that is that's the optimism I have, that it is not just simply all stories of darkness. Yes, our voices are continuously under attack. Tista is, of course, one of the prime examples of that in the country for what she had done during the post-Gujarat riots. So that's all there in front of us. Yes, there are various media organizations which are under, shall we say, the threat. But the problem is, can in the more complex world of information today, is it possible to censor news and produce a monolithic understanding of what news is? And I think that is a challenge. And for us, and that possibly is your next question, how do you operate in this atmosphere? If this is what is there, where are the cracks? I think that is the challenge that we have, and what is it that we can do?
Right, Prabir, like you said, that in some ways is my next question, but also to sort of add to it, I mean, we started with the Windhoek Declaration, and one of the things I found interesting about it was the focus on a collaborative and cooperative understanding of journalism. It was not like today where 10 cameras are pointed at the same event and everyone says they're exclusive news. So the idea that you work together, you train each other, you cooperate, that really animated that. And I think one interesting thing, like both of you pointed out about Julian Assange, is also the fact that his work, I think, broke certain boundaries in terms of what you would call as traditional journalism. The traditional journalism organizations actually depended on him, and people who never identified themselves as journalists, as media persons, really kind of came to the fore. And I think WikiLeaks always offered that possibility that if you're a concerned person, if you're somebody who cares about society, if you care about justice, we will give you that platform. But of course,
I just wanted to come in on one point, if you don't mind, in terms of before we get into the resistance part, because I think that's critical, and we obviously have a time frame. But I know one of the things which has been concerning us for over 30 years, particularly when we launched Communalism Combat, Javed and I, and why we sort of quit, commercial mainstream journalism and decided to do that while not giving up our basic métier of being journalists, was one aspect that was increasingly becoming a reality for journalists who wanted to be extremely deliberative and explorative, not just investigative. Okay, investigative journalism, of course, is huge, very important, but I think journalism is also an explorative role, a deliberative role, which is very, very crucial to understand processes, people's movements, structural inequalities, and structural discrimination. And structural, I mean not just state-driven, but also societal-driven, family-driven, etc. So I think one of the things that really bothered us was that we could not really continue with exploration beyond a certain, time frame when the story is dried out or the story is not hot enough. Now move on to the next story. So, and there are certain issues we believe, and I continue to believe, and there's a broad palette there that require consistent exploration and consistent deliberation. And they're changing all the time. The paradigms there are changing all the time. And one example I'd like to flag, because one can't talk about all of them, is this whole business of hate politics and hate speech. So we've seen a progression in our subcontinent from, hate as political tool to hate as media design, and now as hate as state policy. And if you see this kind of, this progression, and then you see the role of the media in this whole effort. And then you see, of course, very extreme terms like genocide media and all that. I don't want to go into that, but I want to flag how technology then comes to the assistance of these algorithms of hate, and how large, corporations like Facebook and Twitter, and my organization, which is my other face, which is the human rights face, Citizens for Justice and Peace, is involved with a lot of global organizations in trying to get Facebook and Meta to release its HRIA, which is the Human Rights Assessment Report. That, how are you having different standards of algorithms and monitoring between the global south and your own country, which is the United States of America, where certain norms have been put into place, but they've not been put into place for our societies and our countries, where your market is the largest. So we pointed this out in terms of figures, in terms of facts. We've also said that, your non-English, it's true what Provi said about the numbers, but the fact is that social media tools in India in the non-English section, particularly where hate is being disseminated, is massive. It's uncontrollable. And, Facebook and Twitter just do not have the inclination to set any of their standards in place of standards of monitoring. So I'm flagging this issue because it's also an issue which shows the complete hypocrisy of the global north and the United States of America when it talks about wanting to fight, deepen democracy and fight hate, because this is a huge, huge problem we face. So we do something like maybe 50 complaints a month to these different platforms, including, of course, NBDSA, which is because of television, electronic media television. But when we do Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, the kind of responses you get are appallingly irresponsible. I mean, one example, that T. Raja Singh, who happens to be a suspended MLA of the ruling party from Telangana, who now is in the news for making a spate of hate speeches all over the country, including my state of Maharashtra. In 2018, we flagged an obnoxious speech of his, which transgressed the border of free speech and actually went into the hate speech, dimension by international and national jurisprudence standards, because it had the potential to provoke bodily harm and stigma against a section of Indians. And the response we got from Facebook when we flagged that speech, and he had over 3 lakh followers then, 300,000, was that it does not violate our standards. And please, you have the freedom to unfollow Raja Singh. Thank you very much. So this is just one example. So, and there are multiple such examples. And I'm just saying that we need to look at even this dimension of how freedom is being completely warped, is being completely perverted, freedom of expression, and the distinction that is needed to be drawn, which is an ethical distinction between free speech and the right to a life of dignity and a life without discrimination, needs to be put on par for ethical journalists. All journalists and human rights defenders believe this, know it, practice it. But somehow it's not a practice that is followed today in the large sections of the commercial media.
Absolutely. Right. That's an interesting point, actually, to sort of come to my last question, Tista, which is really that I think over the past nearly 1 hour, we sort of looked at a lot of the problems, so to speak. But maybe on a bit more of a personal note, on a professional note, at this point, what is it that gives you hope? What really see as the way forward amidst all the kind of hate, like you said, both, which is really something that is emotional out there, which is really well organized, which has a structure of its own. So how do you see at this point? How do you sort of see resistance and the path?
No, I think I see it both in very traditional journalistic terms, by also modifying in terms of the use of technology, and not just the use of technology in terms of a kind of a extremely manipulative use, but in trying to understand how technology works. So I think both things are really needed. So I think we need to, for instance, master communications in the new media, in the social media, and the video media. So you do it more and more attractively, but you stick to your first principles of journalism, which are the traditional principles, which is you report beats, you report discrimination, you report from the ground, you report people's voices, and you do which is something we were very proud to do at Communalism Combat, which is that you give the voice to activists and people's movements and let them become documentalists and writers and journalists, because there's no one better to tell the story about their movements, even if there are multiple sections of those movements than themselves. And even if you need one independent look as well, but they must be able to document their stories. And I think we are able as a platform, and Sabrang India tries to do this with all the attacks on us. It's been tough, and we are constantly kind of juggling between survival, the legal cases, and actually surviving as a portal, but we somehow managing, is that we're able to do this and report from the ground. Report your labor beat, report your corporation beat, as far as the city is concerned, but report rights issues and rights violations and issues right from the ground. I think you can somehow discover some cracks somewhere. And I think technologically, we need to keep looking at, new ways of making shorter videos, better videos, communication, digital visualization. All of that is needed. And of course, then the more technologically expert things, which I'm not good at, but some of my team members are.
Right, Prabir, a very similar question to you. Some of the issues, these are also very baked into the identity of NewsClick itself. So how in today's age, with the kind of restrictions, attacks, threats, uncertainties, how do you sort of position, where do you see a place for journalists who sort of want to make change, who want to really, in some senses, follow the steps of Julian Assange in the kind of work he did?
Well, I don't think I'm going to say how to follow the footsteps of Julian Assange. It's quite possible Julian will be one and only of his kind. That's quite possible, because he came at a particular historical conjuncture. He's opened the way for lots of people, but it's not that we necessarily all become Julian Assanges, or there will be more. So I think we need to therefore concentrate on what Julian has done and see that we are able to get him out of the Belmarsh prison. Can the world community of people who believe in this work together to do that? So that's one part of it. The question, the challenge, and I do endorse what Pista has said, that how do you bring people's stories and how do you do all of that? And I think that is really a key part of it, but I'll add a little more to that. One is that, of course, that we are not, as you have said earlier, we are not competition with each other, unlike the existing bourgeois media, that we believe in partnership and collaboration. So it is a network of mass media organizations. They're all going to be small, but can they work together? And if they work together on similar ideas, similar issues, then we add to our strength. It is not just a simple addition. It's really a multiplication that happens. And I think that is one thing that we have to look at. How can quote unquote people's media work in a more collaborative way? How do you change the paradigm of media, which is competition with each other, to actually collaboration with each other? I think that is one of the key things, at least for our kind of media to survive. Secondly, we have to also be very clear that just because we believe in certain ideas, we don't have to be slipshod, shoddy, and not understand technology properly. Okay, it's not difficult. Fortunately, it's easy. Tools are there, they can be used. There's a whole lot of material out there. We have to be also able to understand that new forms of expression are emerging and how we can remain on top of that. So it's a challenge to our creativity. And I think that is the second part of what I would say, that collaboration and creativity are the instruments for progressive media who want social change. So how can we harness that to our cost? And the last part, of course, is humor, which I'll leave out for the time being. Okay, that they don't know. The fascists, the dictatorial regimes do not know how to laugh. And I think laughter is also a very good corrective on the fascist. And I would say, remember the great dictator as an example of what Charlie Chaplin did can be actually replicated, but that I'm not making as a serious endeavor for Tista or me to do it. We probably knew completely different sets of people for doing that. But I will only end with one thing, that I think the hatred that Tista talked about, the hatred we see are coming out in different places. The kind of hate, the racial hatred, where an American says, the third world owes America a debt because we rescued you from colonialism. Excuse me, we fought, we got our freedom. You did nothing but come on the side of the colonialists. So that kind of stupidity of, shall we say, the rulers, the global rulers at the moment, that is also something which cannot last. Therefore, I'm also convinced, future is ours, as we always say, but I'm also convinced creativity, critical thinking, all of this, and of course, the ability to be on top of new technologies which are emerging, not thinking that they are only in the hands of the monopolists. These are all things that we have to look at to build a larger mass awareness of which journalists obviously are a part. So more people's journalism, more journalists for the people is the message I will have. At the same time, collaboration as the issue amongst us so that our numbers can grow much. Our power of our numbers can be multiplied much more than just simply being added to each other. So multiplicative means collaboration. Otherwise, it's only at best additive.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Prabir and Tista, for giving us a crash course on how to be branded anti-national, maybe in our context. But also interesting to remember that Julian Assange also faced very similar accusations. Was promptly tagged as a Russian spy. That was one of the main campaigns against him, and in fact, quite an effective campaign as well. The way the US state used that against him. But we're winding up today's session, and once again, I think for all our viewers, it is essential as we talk about World Press Freedom Day. It is essential while you read newspapers, visit websites, watch videos. So I think keep talking about the case of Julian Assange. It is not a closed case. It is a case which goes on. Make noise about it. Talk to your leaders about it. There's in fact a campaign to get politicians from across the world to sign a petition. Public pressure on this has actually led countries, to action in countries like Australia, for instance. There have been global movements taking place, people rallying, people mobilizing, even small groups to keep the fight for justice for Julian Assange ongoing. And, we hope to sort of keep continuing our work on this as well. So on behalf of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, the International People's Assembly and People's Dispatch, we thank all of you who attended this. And once again, thank you, Prabir and Tista as well. And we're winding up for today.